dungeons. I freaking love dungeons. Seriously, get me and a bunch of friends exploring a dank hole in the ground filled with things eager to kill me and a few boss fights, sprinkle in a little bit of loot, and I am fucking sold. You could probably trace my love of games like WildStar, World of Warcraft, and Final Fantasy XIV back to this absolute love of the concept of the modern MMORPG dungeon. These days, dungeons are a pretty formulaic affair. You got 20 to 30 minutes, 3 to 4 bosses with some cool mechanics, a nice motif, a bunch of shiny loot sprinkled throughout. Maybe there's a harder version, who knows? But the rise of the dungeon started long before World of Warcraft. I'm talking about like the video game dungeon, not the creepy torture people dungeon. I'm gonna make a distinction here before I really go into this. I consider dungeons and raids to be two distinct entities within an MMORPG. Dungeons being small group content which persists throughout an entire game's experience from level 10 or so onward, while raids are firmly endgame content, which basically run on a whole different system. But on with the show. Dungeons have always kind of been a staple of RPGs since they were played on pen and paper. Plumbing into a graph paper maze with your mates always seemed like so much fun. Sitting around the table with your friends eventually evolved into not sitting around the table with your friends as multi-user dungeons became this sort of precursor to the MMORPG. Early MMORPGs and MUDs set down a lot of the rules we would have for dungeons today, where dungeons are these dank hellholes where you need to group up with your friends to overcome them. There's generally strong enemies, but the best loot lies at the bottom of these evil, dark places. These old school dungeons during the first generation of MMORPGs were often open-air affairs, meaning that they didn't have a door blocking them from the rest of the world. They were just part of the world. You could treat them like a more difficult zone. You could run into other parties of adventurers, and sometimes they could steal your boss kill from you, which was really annoying back in the day. A few years later, during the second generation of MMORPGs, games like Phantasy Star Online and City of Heroes laid down the basis for the concept of instancing, which allowed people to take that slice of dungeon and specialize it for just a single group of players instead of having everybody running through it at all times. Instancing wasn't universally accepted immediately. In fact, Brad McQuaid, one of the key developers on EverQuest, talked about how instancing should be used sparingly at most, as it threatens to break up the player base. And it kind of does. I mean, if you look at modern World of Warcraft, how much instancing is done in the game, and let me remind you that phasing is just a type of instancing, you can see how it can fracture your player base into different groups. I mean, your garrison phases you clean out of the world. This is why Brad McQuaid's new game Pantheon looks like it's going to be going back to an open-air style dungeon, which I'm not totally against, and it looks interesting, but that's totally in a different direction. So you take the Dungeons & Dragons pen and paper dungeons of antiquity, and you apply a fresh coat of instancing technology on it, and what do you get? Well, you get the archetype for dungeons and MMORPGs for about 12 years. World of Warcraft came out in 2004 and essentially reshaped the landscape of how MMORPGs are done. With this came the new dungeon, the instance dungeon, the 5-man. What would be dungeons in basically every MMORPG since. While there have been some outliers and some people trying some new things in their games, you can't really say that the formula doesn't work. You have this very structured dungeon content now, designed for a small group of players to move through with encounters designed to be both challenging and rewarding, while removing issues like loot competition between groups, instead focusing more on a refined experience. This was the dawn of the modern instanced dungeon. While vanilla World of Warcraft dungeons were not perfect, I mean, if you're going to Blackrock Depths, you should probably pack a lunch, they did, over time, establish the laws that dungeons tend to follow to this day. First of all, early World of Warcraft discovered something interesting about dungeons, and that they're generally better when they're linear. There were some non-linear dungeons in early World of Warcraft, such as the aforementioned Blackrock Depths, but despite the fact that Blackrock Depths is fondly remembered as one of the best dungeons ever made, it has some serious issues. Like, if you had a bad group, Blackrock Depths became a substantially more painful experience to travel through. But for every Blackrock Depths, you wind up with a Gnomeregan, you wind up with a Sunken Temple, and you wind up with the Wailing Caverns. 3 dungeons that had non-linear elements scattered throughout and were very open to exploration in the same way that Blackrock Depths was, but weren't designed to nearly as high a standard, and in the end, just generally became confusing messes, especially for groups that were new or didn't know what they were doing. Again, a bad group could turn these from torturous slogs into straight-up nightmares. All three have fortunately received a fairly substantial overhaul which cuts down on their non-linearity, but at the same time, those were not fun dungeons. Sadly, this means that linearity tended to be much more consistent in delivering an at least fun experience than non-linearity. You could chalk this up to a number of things. Linearity allows for more focus in narrative, theming, and encounters. You could say that the linearity is a very nice contrast to the rest of an MMORPG, which is generally very non-linear. You could say a number of things. But Oranchata! Wait a moment. Black Temple was a fantastic dungeon and had many non-linear components. Blizzard's raid and dungeon designers have gotten really good at telling us something that is non-linear, but then it being completely linear. Black Temple is a great example of this. Black Temple was billed as a non-linear raid, which is kind of funny, but it's kind of a form of false non-linear. While Blackrock Depths was designed to be entered with specific objectives in mind, with various different outcomes that were desirable, from killing Emperor, to getting to the entrance of Molten Core, to just straight up walking to the Black Forge and forging something, Black Temple tricks you by providing you with a false non-linearity. You are given open reign to attack bosses in multiple orders or whatever you want to do, but all of them are needed to progress. In the end, you wind up in the same place. The goal always takes you to Illidan. The choices, therefore, are false, but provide at least the feeling of agency, which makes them feel a little bit more interesting. I'm not saying that non-linearity has no place in dungeons, I just believe that it needs to be in raids instead of just regular dungeons. Now, why do I say that? I believe that non-linearity is very important, but leveling content and non-linearity tend not to mesh very well, because different people enter a non-linear dungeon for different reasons. That said, a non-linear raid, generally you have a group of people entering a non-linear raid for the same reasons, because raids are planned content. You've got a schedule set up. You have a specific roster, and you know what everybody wants and needs, whereas a non-linear dungeon kind of breaks that flow. If the rogue in the group needs one quest, but the tank needs another quest, chances are you're going to go do the tank's quest, and hopefully the group stays together to do the rogue's quest. Consistency is another one of the big laws that came about this new form of dungeon. Burning Crusade, oh look, the Orange Hatter's touting Burning Crusade again, how fucking original, is said to have far superior dungeon content to vanilla, not just because there's more of it, but because dungeons became more consistent. We go from dungeons in vanilla having wildly different boss structures, to most dungeons being refined to about 3 to 4, with I think they top out at 5. And they generally stick within a 20-minute to 30-minute runtime, as opposed to vanilla dungeons, which can go up to like an hour. This is far more satisfying, because generally they're more managed, they feel more focused, and the runtime is long enough to feel meaningful, but short enough that it doesn't become exhausting. Dungeons require a lot of, repetition, so having a shorter runtime and a more focused experience is good for repetition, because then you don't burn out. Finally, one last thing that this new breed of dungeon gave us was refined bosses, and more consistent bosses. So what the hell do I mean by that? I mean that bosses became more interesting. Because you're within a refined dungeon with a set number of players, you can design your dungeon bosses to be more interesting to that group. You can create mechanics that will work for a 5-man group that might not work for the variable numbers of groups in an open-air dungeon experience. Tank and Spank suck. Combat is much more interesting when it's engaging in some way. Trash is trash, you can always throw away trash, but boss fights require you to be aware, manage mechanics, and act accordingly. This makes dungeons feel more engaging. This also extends to loot, as a consistent feel is a lot better than this mini-boss doesn't actually drop loot, despite the fact that he's a named mob with more health. When Cataclysm made its big tuning pass through all of the old world dungeons, this is one of the things I noticed most. If it looks like a boss, it drops loot, which is nice. And thus we have the modern dungeon archetype. An archetype I actually really like, if the beginning of this video wasn't enough of an indication of that. An archetype that feels refined and effective. 3 to 4 bosses, a 20 to 30 minute runtime, a enclosed and thematically consistent dungeon with good loot rules that feels fair and engaging. This is the kind of dungeon we have created. There are some exceptions where dungeons suck. I'm looking at you, 1000 Maws of Toto Rack from Final Fantasy XIV. But generally, this system of dungeon crafting feels good. From World of Warcraft to Lord of the Rings Online to ESO to Final Fantasy XIV to WildStar, this model of dungeoning has become the standard for dungeons. So what's next? What big innovation is going to change dungeoning forever now? Is it going to be Pantheon's return to open-air dungeons similar to what Black Desert Online did? Is it going to be Final Fantasy XIV's trashless trial dungeons? How the hell am I supposed to know? Oh crap, thanks very much for watching this video on dungeons. These are just my opinions on kind of dungeon craft over the last little while and a little bit of history and all that good stuff. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you got any opinions on dungeons, whether you prefer non-linear, whether you prefer linear, whether I'm wrong, whether you're right, whatever, post it down in the comments and I'd love to discuss dungeons with you because these are, of course, just some ideas that I had. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching. I appreciate every viewer. You guys are amazing. And, you go and have a great one.